So you'll notice that when we look at these two sets of images, we have two very different feelings, even as observers of these images that come up when we look at these images. The same is true for our relationships. Not all relationships are the same. No two relationships are alike. They all arrive at different places, and they all are shaped in different ways and at different paces. That's why it's so important for us to have those restorative practices in place to be able to provide our students and our colleagues with the supports and the necessary conversations and things that they need to build those happy, positive relationships that are conducive for learning. So when you think about conflict in your school and in your classroom, what typically happens after you have conflict? What happens when there's conflict? Kids take sides, as do adults. It's natural. There's a win-lose factor in conflict. It ends when someone wins, although no one wins ultimately. That's a good point, Bridget. There's residual anger. Absolutely. One of the things that typically happens with conflict also is harm. There's this thing called harm, a harm in relationships specifically. And by harm, we mean that the relationship, either physical, social, or emotionally, has been frayed to the point that it's not conducive any longer. So you're not moving forward towards a plan, a common purpose or a plan. So there's this fray in that relationship is what we mean by harm. So that's why it's so important for us to have restorative practices in our classrooms and in our schools. The other thing that helps us to really ground ourselves in the why of restorative practices is understanding the connection between social emotional learning and restorative practices. We know right now, post-COVID, that social emotional learning can become a sort of a buzzword right now because everyone's starting to think about the trauma that COVID has caused and also to think about the mental health of teachers and students. But it's so important to think about that as we think about how we are restoring the harm in relationships and the lack of social relationships that have been formed. CASEL, the Collaborative for Social Emotional Learning, defines social emotional learning as an active learning process. So they say process because no one has really arrived in being very competent and totally competent in social and emotional health and well-being. It's a learning process that develops those authentic and lasting relationships. It's a process that helps us to make those responsible decisions. It's a process that helps us to set and achieve positive goals, to show and feel empathy for others, to develop and apply problem solving and those curiosity skills, which are so important for the classroom, and then to develop strong personal identities and a positive self-image. So again, it's a process that youth and adults go through to build these 5 skills to become social and emotional healthy adults and students. Restorative practices can be defined as an emerging social science, and it's a study that strengthens relationships between individuals and communities. It also is a practice that resolves disagreements and helps individuals take ownership of their behavior and engage in acts of empathy and forgiveness. So it's kind of a twofold approach. Restorative practices strengthens those relationships between communities and individuals, but also builds community and connections across our schools as a whole, as a collective. The way that SEL and restorative practices connect, and you can see restorative practices probably show up anywhere on this castle wheel of those 5 competencies. But one of the ones that we're really going to hone in on today would be that relationship skills. And really, that's one of the strongest ways that restorative practices shows up in SEL. And CASEL defines relationships as the ability to communicate clearly, listen well, cooperate with others, resist inappropriate social pressure, negotiate conflict constructively, and seek and offer help when needed. So again, in that definition from Castle, you can see restorative practices all interweaved in that definition with conflict, seeking help, cooperation, all of those buzzwords that come out in that definition speak to restorative practices. So that again gives us the why behind restorative practices and what it means for our students to be able to access curriculum and to truly build a learning environment that is conducive for all students. All right, so I know that in alternative schools, you all have heard this countless times, the difference between traditional discipline and restorative justice or restorative practices. Would anyone like to share what they think the difference of that is between those two things is? And you can share it in the chat or you can come off mute.
So I think of it as giving students an opportunity to learn from what happened and I don't want to say right the wrong that was committed, but allow them to repair the harm that was done, as opposed to punishment, which is often disconnected to what happened, whereas this is more connected. Like it's more logical consequences that follow as opposed to just a random consequence because that's what the rule book says we're supposed to do when this happens.
I love that analogy between connected and disconnected. Traditional discipline was a little bit more disconnected. That human connection piece was disconnected. It was less about the human and the student and the person and more about the infraction and the thing that that student did. Great analogy. Also in the chat, we have student takes ownership in repairing the harm. Then we have to even an uneven playing field of discipline. Awesome. Restorative approach allows a student to remain engaged in the school community instead of put out for 5 to 10 days. Absolutely. So it's all about keeping that student engaged and making that human connection again. So in traditional discipline, again, it's very focused on those policies and those rules that have been in place. So often when a student breaks a rule in a traditional discipline, you're meeting with the principal, you're sent for a consequence. And it sometimes does include that 5 to 10 days out of school. So you're losing instruction. Whereas with the restorative practice, a restorative justice approach to discipline, you're repairing the harm that is done. So that student is taking ownership of something that was done to repair the harm in that relationship. But not only is it just a response to a behavior or a situation that has occurred or a conflict. Restorative justice includes those preventive strategies as well. How do we build a community in our school and in our classroom that is conducive so that students are not having conflict, that they feel like they connect and they belong in that building and that they belong, that they're valued and that I can't even talk, that their input is valued so that they're not having to have conflict with one another or with themselves. So restorative justice really brings in the human piece of discipline. Oftentimes schools utilize a multi-tiered system of supports, and we can say the same is true for restorative practices. There are multiple tiers of restorative practices. At tier 1, these are practices that all students receive support around, and there are things that we put in place and strategies that adults and students integrate and practice to be able to provide restorative opportunities to build community. Then there's tier 2, those practices that when harm is done, that there's something additional layered on top of those tier 1 practices that groups of students can have access to. Then there are tier 3 practices and restorative practices that those individuals who need more intensive supports or even reintegration could have access to. So let's look at those tiers defined. Tier 1 in the multiple tiers of restorative practices might look like community building. And that's ensuring that everyone in the building feels that they're connected, they belong there, and that they're represented in the classroom and the community. Are there texts that are used in your classrooms that represent various backgrounds? Is there place in your curriculum and in your policy building for student voice and for family voice? So all of those things that you do to build that community happen in tier 1. And this is available and should be available to everyone in your building. At tier 2, these practices for restorative justice happen when there's harm and there's healing that is needed. So harm could be conflict. It could be some harm or fray in a relationship between two individuals or a community of individuals. So at tier 2, the whole aim of those tier 2 practices is to address the harm, unearth what happened, and develop a plan. At tier 3, this is where you might have a student who, because of the nature of the infraction, may have had to be suspended. Maybe it's a weapon or something like that. Tier 3 might happen when a student needs to be reintegrated into the community. We're not saying that they have to be, totally put out for fighting on the bus or whatever the case might be, but how do we make sure that they see themselves when they come back into our school community after their suspension or after being separated as part of the community, and making sure that they have the supports that they need to re-enter into our community. Within the tiers, the multiple tiers of restorative practices, there are different elements and different practices that occur. It might look like community building circles, restorative and affective language and listening, restorative chats and conferencing, circles, and mediation or peer mediation. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into each of those. Community building circles are really put in place to build community and SEL and relationship skills for our students and our adults. It might look like those morning rituals, staff meetings, teaching. You can also use it when you're teaching content, dialogue circles, and even your problem-solving circles. So for instance, how you integrate those community building circles so that it's not seen as something separate might be literature circles. So I'm taking time in your day to do Socratic circles or text discussion circles, or even concentric circles where they're communicating with others in building those SEL skills around relationship building in the classroom. So this is one way to integrate that so that it's not seen as something different. The other skill would be to integrate restorative and effective language and active listening. We know listening is the #1 skill to have when you're restoring any harm to a relationship. We can say that from our personal relationships with our spouses or friends or whomever, that listening is the main thing to do. But there's also this thing called effective language. And here, the purpose of this and using it in the classroom and in the school is to teach and model empathy, which again is a social emotional skill, to be able to have that social awareness, to teach students to recognize their own feelings, but to also increase communication and social skills. And you would use this in all interactions with your students and each other. An example of that would be to use those affective statements. And an affective statement, and we think of affect, we think of feelings and nurturing almost. So it starts with an observation. It names the feelings and the needs that come up, and it identifies a plan. So an example of that would be, I noticed that you were upset this morning, and I value your participation. In the future, will you chat with me before storming out of the room? You'll notice that the observation was, you were upset this morning. You're telling that student, I see you. The feeling was, I value, and you're using I statements in an effective statement. You're saying, I value, I see you, I love you in a sense. And then the need is you want that student to participate. You want them to be there and learning And the plan is to chat with me before you storm out of the room. So that's an example of an effective statement. We can also use restorative chats. And these are the ones when we think of restorative practices that often come up. We think of those capturing kids' hearts curriculums and things like that. These are really short chats with a student who is experiencing some challenges or having a conflict, or even having a minor disruption or misbehavior, that you can bring them and ground them and let them know that what you're doing is causing a disruption, is causing harm to others. So let's have a chat about that. An example of that would be to ask some restorative questions. You can ask the student, what happened? What were you thinking of at the time? Which is different than what were you thinking? What were you thinking of at the time? What have you thought about since? Again, get into the feelings, those underlying feelings that the student was having. Who has been affected and in what way? Getting to the empathy of the situation. And then what do you think you need to do to make things right? So not telling that student, well, you need to go have a chat with me. It's saying, what do you think you need to do to make things right? And again, this is happening when a student has caused harm to a relationship, which could be a student who is engaging in a minor disruption in a classroom, for instance. I am seeing something in the chat. It says you must also be able to give effective statements that are positive. You're a good reader. Effective. I am really excited your reading has improved. I'm very proud of you. Absolutely, Alexis. Absolutely. That is definitely an effective statement. So those three restorative practices are definitely ones that are more of the preventive restorative practices that we're looking at. There are also some ways that we can respond to harm that is done in restorative justice. And that might look like circles. So when there is harm that has been done and you have a conflict, you could bring two parties together to do a circle or a conference with a skilled facilitator to help them understand the impact of their actions and make a plan to stop the wrongdoing. You could also engage in a more structured mediation process. We often see this with student support services, but it can be done by anyone who's skilled in facilitating it. Even older students can do peer mediation, but it's really used to mediate those serious conflicts between two individuals. So those are two of the more responsive restorative practices that we can use. So I have said a mouthful. Wanted to give you just a background of what restorative practices were in a short amount of time. It was a very short session, but I want to give you a chance to put it all together. And we're going to be practicing with an activity called scenarios. So really what the question that you're answering in the scenarios activity will be, what is the appropriate prevention strategy and or response? Because remember, restorative practices have those preventive practices that we do all the time to build community and prevent misbehavior and harm, and then those responsive strategies and practices that we use. So I'm going to be giving you a list of different strategies, different scenarios. You'll read in a small group, you'll read each scenario one at a time. And for each of those scenarios, you'll be identifying what tier of restorative practice would be appropriate, and then discuss ways that you might integrate some of those restorative elements into the scenario. Your activity guide will look like this. And Frederick has already dropped that for you. Thank you so much. On the front page, you'll have a recap of everything that I shared. You'll have the tiers there, those multiple tiers of restorative practices. You'll have the list of the essential elements that we shared and talked about. And then you'll have a list of different scenarios to talk about with your small group. Are there any questions before we get started? All right, give me just a second. I will get you in your rooms. All right, room should be opening. If at any time you need help when you're in your breakout room, feel free to return to the main room or ask for help using the Zoom feature at the bottom. Anyone who's feeling brave can share. I know we all may have had a Jenny at one point in time. What are some of those elements, even if we didn't want to say the tiers, that we would use for Jenny's situation?
Hi, Ivy. This is Michael Clark Webb, and I was in group 2, I think it was. I'm a counselor, so I'm terrible with numbers. But we thought that Jenny was definitely in tier 2. I think we had an agreement of that, depending on maybe the age. If it was someone who was 17 and the items were worth a certain amount, there might be a policy about that, more so for an older one, but an older student. But we felt like we could do more of the restorative practices with the younger child, and just possibly do the community building circle, and use some of those questions that you shared with us. What were you thinking at the time, and kind of what was going on, and what do you think you need to do to make this right, and how can we help you in the future? What can we do for you that might help you? Because if you get the idea that possibly the student needed it, there was a need there, then you could address that one way. But if it was just an impulse or anger, you could address it a different way.
Absolutely. So digging a little bit deeper, you said
Mm-hmm.
depending on what she stole, and even like, did she steal an iPad or was it a pencil?
Right.
Right. Absolutely. Any other thoughts on Jenny's scenario?
Well, I can just share, this is Barbara. I can just share that kind of what we've just recently adopted, and it seems to be working in most scenarios. Our student goes into what we call the off-trust room. They must fill out a reflection sheet, which asks all those essential questions. Who's at fault? What did you do? Creating I statements, so that it's really about them taking responsibility, talking about how they're feeling now, who's been harmed. After that, we have some coping strategies that we're trying to teach them. So those things are available to them. And then they actually have to write an email to the offended person that just, that takes responsibility. What are they? We're not asking for an apology if that's not what you're feeling, but we're asking for you to say, this is what I did. And that's been a real, that's been huge. So then when they return to class, if it happens in a classroom, when they return to class, there is a quick restorative circle that just has the students saying how they feel, and the person doing some active listening, and the active listener, the offender, I guess, saying, this is what I heard you say. So it's this cycle of responsibility taking, bringing them back into the community, and taking, and not pushing them out or so.
I love that.
With Jenny, we also would, we have materials all over the place for kids. Like, we don't, she wouldn't have a need necessarily. And if there were, anyway, we go on to mental health resources if that's what she was doing, just as attention seeking, et cetera, et cetera. But that's our restorative process that we've used in multiple scenarios.
I love that. And you just hit on all those essential elements, even to reintegration, what the plans are for that. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And then very quickly, would anyone like to share very quickly what you would do for Lou and Django, who keep getting in the fights at recess?
Well, we didn't get to that scenario because we were in our own little scenarios. But I mean, I think all the things that Barbara just mentioned are an excellent example of having both students really reflect on what they did to contribute to the issue and how they're going to repair the issue.
Absolutely. And when you think about a physical altercation, oftentimes, and we mentioned this earlier, there is a suspension or something that takes them away from the learning environment. So that reintegration process of them being in tier 3, and those strategies for tier 3 are going to have to occur. That mediation or conflict resolution will have to occur between those students for scenario 2. So thank you so much for sharing. I know that was a speed lightning activity in the interest of our session, but I do want to give you time to get to your next session. Let me give you our next exit ticket activity, which is called a chat waterfall. So in the chat, you're going to queue up without hitting submit one takeaway that you would like to keep in the back of your mind, put in your back pocket. I know this is not new for you, for most of you, or a strategy that you would like to try that you heard from a colleague. But queue that up in the chat, but don't hit submit. And when you hit submit, we'll create a chat waterfall when I cue you. All right, when you are ready, you can submit. What is your one takeaway? Y'all are really good. Oftentimes we have 1 or 2 people who submit right away. And feel free to comb back through those and see what your peers selected as well. Thank you so much for your time today. Again, I'm Ivy Mack. I'll leave you with the quote on your way out. It's relationships, not programs, that change children. Young people thrive when adults care about them on a one-to-one level and when they have a sense of belonging to a caring community. Enjoy the rest of your symposium today.
Thank you.
Thank you.